Let me get recording started. Good. Okay, Johannes, go ahead and take us away. We have an hour.
Great. Thanks a lot. So hi, everyone. Good evening from Paris. So this is a paper called Growth and the Fragmentation of Production. It's joint work with Ezra Oberfield. And I should say, because this has been recorded, all these results are very preliminary and may change. So, and I should also say this is very much still work in progress. So I think we have some interesting results to show, but we kind of don't have the final numbers yet. We're still working on that. Okay, so motivation is pretty straightforward. So for a long time, people have been talking about a link between specialization and productivity. So there's a very well-known and famous sentence, the very first sentence of The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith writes, the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor, so labor productivity, seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. So, and then after that, he starts talking about the pin factory. And I think the really interesting word in this sentence is in particular greatest. Okay? So Adam Smith thinks that increased division of labor, increased specialization is something that has been important in the process of increasing labor productivity. And I would say it's fair to say that we don't know very much about the quantitative role of specialization in the process of economic growth. So this is something that we want to look at in this paper. So in this paper, we're not going to look at division of labor within plants, so kind of pin factory example, but we're going to look at specialization in the value chain. So we're going to look at how the value chains are broken down into work done by different plants, because this is what we observe in the data. So in particular, we're going to study specialization in the value chain among plants and growth in the Indian manufacturing sector from about the year 1990 up to 2015. Okay, and in this setting, we have information about the vertical specialization of the plants. So that's coming from data on intermediate inputs of these plants and the outputs. So effectively, we're looking at whether, for example, a producer of shirts, a factory that produces only shirts, produces these shirts from cloth or from yarn. Okay, that's what we see from the input and from the output data. Okay, so in that sense, we would say that the producer of shirts from cloth would be specialized or more specialized than a producer of shirts from yarn, for example. Okay, so I'll first show you a bunch of empirical results. So these, in the beginning, these results are just kind of motivational. First, at the macro level, we're going to find a very strong positive relationship between specialization, so of these plants, and the level of development. Okay, so we're going to look at across districts of India, plants that are more vertically specialized in the sense of producing, shirts from cloth, for example, as opposed to shirts from yarn, tend to be in richer areas. But we also find the same patterns in the time dimension. Okay, so increased specialization is positively associated with growth at the aggregate level. Okay, so that kind of motivates this paper. Then we look at the micro level. So we're going to look at within industries. We're going to find that plants that are more vertically specialized, on average, are larger. Okay, they have also so they have higher sales, they have more employees, and so on. Okay. But again, also in the time dimension. So as plants vertically specialize, they grow on average, and the more they specialize, they grow faster. Okay? We're going to have a bunch of regressions where we look at the effect of demand shocks. So as demand increases, plants vertically specialize more. So that kind of points to some kind of non-homogeneity in the use of intermediate inputs. Okay? We also look at regressions where we study the propagation of demand shocks. So demand shocks propagate upstream. That's what you would get in a normal, neoclassical model with constant returns to scale. But they not only propagate upstream, but also downstream again. So there must be scale economies present at some point, maybe at the firm level, maybe at the sector level, maybe across sectors and so on. Okay, so we are going to interpret these empirical results through the lens of a model. So I'll first show you kind of a stylized, simple model that serves to, clarify the mechanisms that are going on in this, how we are thinking about these empirical facts. So firms are going to make or buy decisions for inputs, okay? And they have to invest into something that affects the cost of particular intermediate inputs. We're going to call that the search for suppliers of a particular input. Okay? So that gives rise to economies of scale. So when demand is very high, the firms are going to invest more in the search for suppliers, and therefore they're going to have lower cost of production and will in the end produce and sell more. Okay, so that's scale economies, and we're going to have that firms are ex ante heterogeneous in terms of their hitched into productivity, and are going to select into specialization based on that productivity. Okay, so firms that are born with a high productivity are going to search more, but they're going to tilt the search effort particularly to suppliers of downstream goods, and therefore on average they will end up looking more vertically specialized. Okay, so that's how we're going to think about these within industry cross-sectional patterns about size and specialization. Okay, so that's kind of first the simple model, and then I'm going to, if I have time, I'm going to sketch how we embed these these mechanisms into a full quantitative model that we're currently working on, using for quantitative analysis, calibrating some parameters, maybe estimating some other parameters, and then use them for counterfactuals. So this is kind of what we're still in the process of doing. Hopefully in a few weeks' time, we'll have some quantitative results. Okay, very quickly about the literature. So there's some, of course, some very classic papers about specialization and productivity, Stigler, Sherwin, Rosen, and so on. I would say there's relatively little empirical evidence about the relationship between specialization and productivity, performance, and so on. You have a bunch of papers that show, for example, cross-sectional relationships. There's this famous result that if you look at doctors, for example, medical doctors, in smaller cities, you tend to have more general practitioners, so doctors are not specialized, whereas in larger cities, doctors tend to practice their particular specialized field of medicine. Okay, but this is not something that's very easy to use for quantitative analysis in a growth model. So we'll try to make progress on that. There is a literature on Smithian growth, so growth through increased specialization. It's not something that we tend to teach to undergraduates, at least in most places, so that's in textbooks. So there's actually quite a bit of an economic history literature on that, but anyway, that's on the side. But the paper is also related to this literature on the Indian trade liberalization, because that's a shock that we're using for identification. Okay, so the data that we're using is the Indian Annual Survey of Industries, or ASI. That's, by the way, the same data set that she and Tino, for example, have used, and many others. We have data from 1990, so before the liberalization episode, up to 2015, with a couple of gaps in between. So for some years, we don't have data. The ASI is a plant-level panel of formal manufacturing plants. So in any given year, you have all the plants that have at least 100 employees. And in any given year, you have about a fifth of all plants that have between 20 and 100 employees, or 10 and 100 employees if the plant is using power. Okay. The most important part of that survey for us is that you have very detailed information about both the outputs that these plants are producing. So you have unit values, quantities, you have 5-digit product codes, but you also have the same thing on the input side. So you have separately for domestically sourced and for imported intermediate inputs, 5-digit product codes, quantities, unit values, and so on. Okay. So here are a couple of examples for these product codes: bleached silk yarn, beryllium copper wire, aluminium ingots, and so on. Okay. So there are about 5,500 of them. So roughly you can think about HS6. Okay. The medium plant is using 3 of those 5-digit intermediate inputs in the production process. There are some plants that have very simple production process that use a single 5-digit intermediate input. Okay, so for example, think about producing bricks from clay. Okay, you just need clay. That's one 5-digit input. But there are also some plants that have very many intermediate inputs and have complicated production processes and so on. Okay. The first thing that you see when you look at these intermediate input mixes is that there is a lot of heterogeneity within very narrow industries. So here are some plots that we already had in the last paper, but this is very relevant here as well. So in the right panel, you can see the input mixes of plants that in that particular year produce only one single output, and that's polished diamonds. That's one of those 5-digit product codes. Okay. And here I'm plotting the materials cost share, sorry, the cost share of a particular input in the mix of material inputs. So here on the top left in that graph, you can see these are plant year observations that produce polished diamonds entirely from cut diamonds. Okay. So what they're doing is they're getting the cut diamonds and then they're polishing them. Okay? And that's the output of the plant. And then the bottom right here, these are guys that produce only polished diamonds from rough diamonds. So they're taking the rough diamonds, okay? Could be coming from inside the plant, or it could be coming, sorry, from inside the firm or from outside of the firm. It could be bought, or it could be just sourced from another plant belonging to the same firm. But they're taking the rough diamonds, they're cutting the rough diamonds, and then afterwards they're polishing the rough diamonds, okay? And these guys here on the bottom left, they're using mostly another 5-digit input in the production process, which is industrial diamonds, okay? So effectively, what I want to show you with this picture is that by looking at the mix of intermediate inputs, you can say something about which vertically related stages in the production process these plants are performing. The guys on the top left, they're vertically specialized, they're just doing the polishing, whereas the guys on the bottom right, they're doing both the cutting of the diamonds and the polishing of the diamonds, okay? And of course, this is just one example, but kind of these patterns are ubiquitous, okay? So you see that for many other industries as well. Here's on the left is another example for bleached cotton cloth. It would produce it from unbleached yarns, from bleached yarns, from unbleached cloth, and so on, okay? So we'd like to measure this in a kind of more systematic way. So we're gonna construct a measure of what we call the vertical span of production, okay? So we do that in 2 steps. The first step is we define a measure of vertical distance of an input from an output. So this is a measure that varies at the product pair level, at the input output level, okay? And what we want to capture here is that rough diamonds are more distant from the final output from polished diamonds than cut diamonds. So cut diamonds are in between, okay? So we do that in the following way. We, for example, here for cotton shirts, we first look at the input basket, the aggregate input basket of single product producers. So here it would be only plants that produce cotton shirts. Let's say 70% of the input expenditure is in cotton cloth and 30% is in cotton yarn, okay? And let's assume cotton cloth is entirely produced using cotton yarn, okay? So then we would say cotton cloth is 1 step away from the final output because it's only showing up as a direct input in the production of cotton shirts. Whereas cotton yarn is, well, an average of 1 and 2 steps away. Because once it's showing up as a direct input, and the second time it's showing up kind of 2 steps away via cotton cloth, okay? And we're taking the weighted average of 1 and 2 in this case. And the weights are, you know, these cumulative weights in these individual baskets. So 30% and 70% times 100%, okay? So in that sense here, for this example, we would get that yarn is 1.7, you know, steps away on average from the output from shirts, okay? So just to show you that kind of the numbers that we get from this exercise is reasonable. So here I do this example for, you know, for cotton shirts. Fabrics or cloths, so inputs that contain the strain fabric or cloth are relatively downstream to have a short vertical distance. Yarns are further upstream. Ginned and pressed cotton is even further upstream, and then raw cotton is kind of the furthest upstream. Okay, that's relatively straightforward for, you know, for simple production processes. It gets more tricky when you know there are cycles in the production process. So one example is aluminium ingots. Aluminium can be produced using aluminium scrap, but could also be produced using bauxite and you know, caustic soda and so on. Okay. So what we're doing is when we construct these trees, we're always cutting out any input that is already showing up further downstream in that tree. So that's very important for these production processes that contain cycles, for example, for aluminium. And if you do that, then, you know, these distances that you get actually make sense. Okay, so bauxite and coal is very upstream, and then kind of more processed inputs are further downstream. Okay. So that's the first step. So that's this measure of vertical distance. And then in the second step, we construct for each plant the weighted average distance of the inputs that the plant is actually reporting from the output that the plant is reporting. Okay. And the weights here is the expenditure shares in the materials basket of the plant. Okay, so effectively we're asking how far away from the output of the plant are the inputs that the plant is reporting according to this vertical distance measure. Okay, so when I construct this, of course, I have to take a stance on what is the output of the plant. So just to be as clean as possible, we're only going to do that for single product plants. For multi-product plants, you could do something similar as well, but then you would have to make an assumption about which inputs get used in the production of which outputs, which in general we don't have. Okay, so just to be clear, we're in all the following, we're only going to talk about single product plants. And of course, you should keep in mind that these are maybe not the largest plants, not the most relevant ones, and so on. Okay. All right. So
Johannes, what share of the plants or what share of the value added do these plants account for?
I don't know the value added, but in terms of shares, I think about 1/2 is single product plants. The other half are multi-product plants.
Or share in value. I suppose it's less than half, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would think so, but
I wanted to get a sense.
Yeah, I don't have the number, and I should know the number. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so coming back to this example from before, the polished diamonds, the guys that use the cut diamonds that only do the final stages of the value chain, we would say that they have a short vertical span, or they're more vertically specialized. The guys that do both of the steps, that use the rough diamonds, we would say they have a long vertical span, or they're less vertically specialized. Okay. All right, so bunch of facts about vertical specialization according to this measure. First of all, kind of macro facts. So there's a strong positive relationship between specialization and the level of development. So here, what I show you is a bin scatter. Okay, we are running a regression of the vertical span of a plant. Okay, on the district GDP per capita of the district in India where the plant is located in. Okay, and we have industry times year fixed effect. So what that means is within industries, or within industry year cells, the plants that are more vertically specialized, okay, that have a short vertical span, tend to be in districts of India that are richer. Okay, so that's already an interesting pattern. Okay. Second fact is the same thing, but in a time dimension. Okay, so vertical specialization is positively correlated with growth. Okay, so this is a regression where now we have plant or plant product fixed effects. So all the variation is coming from time variation. Okay, and we see that in this case, it's state level GDP per capita is positively associated with specialization. Okay, or negatively associated with span, which is the inverse of specialization. Okay, so kind of these two facts, we take them as motivational. So maybe they tell us that there's something interesting about specialization in the process of growth. Okay? So now we move to the micro level, and in this,
Johannes,
yep.
I know that you're later going to get into shocks, and maybe that's going to make it a little bit more more persuasive. But at this stage, what role could just the proximity to the consumer be playing? So you're producing more downstream goods, you're closer to the consumer. That seems like a natural thing to do. And because land is presumably more costly in these richer districts, you're going to do less of the stages that are upstream and farther away from the consumer, no? So, although it's from industry year fixed effects. But
exactly. Everything is holding fixed the output, and we're looking at variation in the intermediate inputs. So are the inputs something that is very close to the output?
HS5, you're holding fixed the HS5.
Exactly. HS6 roughly, so 5 digits, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Okay. Yep. Sorry, there was another question.
Because you mentioned before about the example with the hospitals or doctors, and so do you get the same things with size? So this is like income per capita, but in terms of the size of the, I don't know, in terms of economic activity or population.
Are the plants larger in
more specialized in areas that are bigger or more economic activity?
So the next fact 3 is going to be about size and specialization, but that's going to be within an industry. That's not going to be across districts. So what we find here is that within an industry, the plants that are more vertically specialized on average are larger. Okay, so in the going back to the example of the polished diamonds, the guys that use the cut diamonds as an input, that only do the polishing, on average have higher sales than the guys that produce the polished diamonds from rough diamonds. Okay, I don't know about kind of plant size and the level of development. You could imagine that maybe there's also a relationship, but I haven't checked that.
Hey,
Okay.
Johannes, I think that the story on being closer to the consumer and perhaps land is expensive kind of holds up there in general, but still, because even within industries, if you're not producing the things that are upstream in rich locations, you're quite naturally going to get something like this, no?
So I would say in this plot here, all these firms within industry, they would be equally close to the consumers. I'm sure kind of there is different, market sizes in these different districts, and there is going to be variation. So that's what we're picking up here with the span in kind of how many of these stages you're doing. But at least the final output, I would think that kind of these guys are equally close to the final consumers.
Because these are only single product firms, so it can't be that they're producing really their core production is the upstream industry, and they're just selling a little bit of final goods locally.
That's right, exactly.
Areas. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, like in general about the multi-product fact. So I mean, here we really want to focus on one particular dimension of the firm's organizational choice or kind of production decisions. We kind of want to take out all these multi-product dimension, and we really want to focus on conditional on being only in one of those value chains with one particular fixed output. Okay, which of these intermediate inputs are you using in the production process? So that's not to say that kind of this is maybe the most relevant. I don't know, right? Of course, there's a lot of work on multi-product firms and so on. Maybe you could also imagine this choice of the output being potentially important. So here we want to kind of just narrow things down on this one particular margin of the firm's decisions. Okay, I've mentioned kind of that the data, the unit of observation that we're having in the data is the plant. Okay, so that's not, unfortunately we cannot link this to the firm level. Okay, but because we don't have the firm identifiers for the different plants. But what we do know is whether the plant has any other sister plants that belong to the same firm, and we can look at exactly the same relationships only for firms, only for plants that do not have sister plants, so that are single plant firms. Okay, and you find exactly the same patterns. So maybe the multi-plant margin is also something that's important. Right? That's something that's not so easy for us to look at. Because if there are other plants, we don't know what they're doing. Okay? But kind of we really want to kind of condition on this particular margin of organizational choice. Okay, some other cross-sectional covariates of vertical span. So plants that are more vertically specialized have on average higher share of materials in total cost. Okay, that's maybe obvious. I don't know. Plants that are more vertically specialized appear generally to be the better ones. Okay, I've shown you that they're larger on average. They're more likely to import from abroad. They're more likely to export. They're having a higher share of non-production workers. They have higher markups, so sales to cost ratios, and so on. Yeah. Plants that are more vertically specialized also, on average, have a higher share on relationship-specific inputs in their overall materials bundle. Okay. So that could be just mechanically coming from the fact that relationship-specific inputs tend to be processed goods, and the homogeneous ones are maybe the very upstream raw materials. Okay. Fact 4 is the same thing as fact 3, but again in the time dimension. Okay, so sales growth is positively correlated with increased vertical specialization, or negatively correlated with this changes in vertical span. Okay, so these again regressions where we have plant product fixed effects. So conditional on staying in a particular product, conditional on staying in a single product. If your vertical span is going down, you're specializing more. On average, your sales are going up. Yeah. All right, so let's try to get to some causal stuff. So we're using the Indian trade liberalization to get at variation in demand conditions. So the story is the following: until the end of the 1980s, India was in near autarky. They were operating an import licensing system, so you had to have an import license if you wanted to import. And even if you were allowed to import, you were facing very high tariffs, and tariffs that were varying a lot across different input product codes. Okay, so here this is across 6-digit HS lines. In 1990, there's a lot of variation in the import tariffs. On average, the tariffs are very high, so about 75–80%. Okay? And then in 1991, India was facing a balance of payment crisis, and they started liberalizing. First they removed this import licensing system, and they started cutting tariffs. And then the tariffs are coming down by 1997 to an average of about 35%. And then kind of over time, these tariffs are coming down even further. Okay, so you can see that the overall change in the tariffs from 1990 up to post 1997 is mostly driven by the initial level of the tariff. And it so happens that this initial level of the tariff was set very early on in the 1950s in the second 5-year plan of India. Okay, and then they remained unchanged pretty much until the end of the 1980s. Okay, so most of that variation, sort of the changes, so the variation across product codes, was something that was set in 1950s, and therefore people have argued that this is relatively unrelated to the state of the industries at the start of the 1990s. Okay, so there are a couple of papers, Amit Khandelwal, Peter Topolova, Penny Goldbergs, and several others that have used kind of these tariff liberalization as a source of exogenous variation. Okay, so here's a regression that effectively shows or argues that these tariff changes act as demand and supply shocks from the perspective of the firm. So if there is a decrease in the tariffs on the good that you're producing, then you're faced with increased import competition, and then your sales are going down. Okay, that's the first row. If the tariffs are going down on intermediate inputs that you're using in the production process, okay, then you're faced with lower costs of inputs, and therefore you're able to scale up and your sales are going up. Okay, so that would be like a positive supply shock. Okay? So we're going to mostly use these tariffs as changes in demand conditions. So we're going to think of this as a shifter to import competition from the perspective of these firms. Okay, and I should mention all these regressions that I'm doing now. I'm going to do kind of two sets. One is where we pull the whole panel. We use all the data that we have. Okay. Of course, that kind of maximizes, the amount of observations that we have, but we also do sets of regressions where we only look at long run changes. So from before the liberalization to after 1997. Okay. Of course, that means that, we are losing a lot of observations because we're conditioning on these plants still producing the same stuff, remaining single product plants and so on. Okay. But the results are pretty similar throughout. Okay. So, the next set of regressions is coming back to this relationship between size and span. Okay, so we're regressing the vertical span on the sales of the plants, and in the OLS we find this negative coefficient. So that's the same relationship that I've shown you before. This relationship between increased specialization and increased sales. Okay? But in columns 4 to 6, we're instrumenting large sales by the level of the tariff on the output that the plants are producing. Okay, so this is effectively, the way we're thinking about this is, this is affecting import competition. So that's going down. Sales are going down when you're faced with these lower tariffs on the goods that you're producing. Okay, and what we find is still negative and significant coefficients. So what that means is that as you're shrinking because of increased import competition, you're actually reporting a higher vertical span, so less vertical specialization. Okay, there are a couple of products where temporarily, at least, tariffs are going up during that sample. It's not very many, but there are a few of them. And then an increase in demand because an increase in the tariff on the stuff that you're producing, would be associated with an increase in sales and a decrease in the vertical span. Okay, so in that sense, yep.
Go ahead, finish, please.
So in that sense, we're thinking of these regressions as supporting Adam Smith's famous dictum about the division of labor being limited by the extent of the market. The extent of the market being demand conditions here, which is affected by this input competition shifter, and division of labor is kind of the fragmentation of the value chain in the sense of how much you're doing, how vertically specialized are you. Okay, Cecilia, yep.
And have you looked at whether these firms are switching products or adding products? I know you have only one product plant, but what happens if the firm either switches its product or it adds a product? You just drop it out of the sample?
That's right. So here we're using all the observations that are single product plant years, so plant year observations. And we're dropping anything where there are multiple products being reported. So in that sense, here we're conditioning on these terms remaining single product. Now, so Penny Goldberg, of course, has these papers, and Prothos, they have these papers about, you know, the tariff liberalization and what happens to the range of products. So we know that there is some action on that margin going on, but this is kind of what we're taking out by conditioning on the single product and on the same product.
Right, but I was just wondering how firms are responding in terms of perhaps trying to escape competition and switching the product category, etc.
I'm pretty sure there's some of that.
How much selection bias you might have from these firms just being inactive, right? So these seem like from the perspective of firms wanting to escape competition, the worst behaved ones, they're just stuck with the worst competition and they weren't able to do anything about it.
Yeah, that's right. So in that sense, I mean, you should think of this sample being selected in that sense. Yes, of course, kind of. I mean, when we run these regressions, we're also selecting on survival usually. So I think some selection is inevitable, and you should keep in mind that kind of this is selected in the sense of these guys still being single product with the same product as before. Okay, so that's this set of results. We have a number of other results which I want to talk about relatively quickly. So vertical specialization comes with a reduction in the number of intermediate inputs. So as these guys are vertically specializing, they're reducing the number of intermediate inputs. As they're becoming less vertically specialized, they're increasing the number of intermediate inputs. Okay, so the way we are thinking about that is that, you know, production is kind of like an inverted pyramid, where at the bottom tip of that pyramid is the output. And you should either be producing this output from a small number of processed inputs, that's kind of the relatively downstream inputs, or very many raw materials that are being combined in several different production steps. Okay, so then kind of if you're not very specialized, you're using these many different intermediate inputs that are all raw materials. Whereas if you're very specialized, you're using few very highly processed intermediate inputs.
Can I ask a quick question? So I wonder about the role of external scale economies. So do you take into account the location of these plants? So as they get more vertically specialized, maybe they are more likely to be located within a cluster?
So that's interesting. I'll have some results that maybe go a little bit towards external economies of scale. Just to be precise about what we are measuring here. So here, the unit of observation is the plant, and the plant is identified by a particular address. So we do not have any moves in the data by construction. We could, of course, look at, you know, the presence of other firms and what is happening to them, and maybe look at heterogeneity and so on. And I think, you know, that would be interesting. I'll have some regressions, which I'll show you in a moment, where we are looking at the presence of suppliers and the propagation of these shocks. Yeah.
May I
Okay.
ask also a related question, which is, have you looked at heterogeneous responses? In the beginning, you talked about some firms producing these very complex products and others very simple. Across these two sets of firms, do you see any differential response?
So we've looked a little bit at heterogeneity, and in particular, we've looked at heterogeneity in the degree of relationship specificity of the inputs. So all these things that kind of I'm showing you tend to be stronger when the inputs of the industry are more relationship specific. So that's what we kind of that's one reason why in the model we call this search for suppliers, because relationship specific inputs are ones, where you need to search, you need to pair up with a particular supplier, whereas maybe the homogeneous inputs are the ones where you can always go to a particular market and you don't need to actually search. So kind of this has led us to go in that direction. I don't have these results in the slides right now, but pretty much all these things are stronger for industries where which rely more heavily on relationship specific inputs. But of course, there are many other dimensions of heterogeneity, which you might want to look at and which we haven't done yet. All right. So tariff supply and demand shocks are affecting entry. So when the tariffs on the output are going down, that decreases the number of plants in a particular industry or a particular industry times location. If tariffs on the inputs are going down, then that increases the number of plants in a particular location again. And input tariffs are also affecting input adoption. So if the tariffs on a particular input are going down, then that increases the probability of a plant using a particular input. Okay. All right, I want to show you another set of regressions, which is going in the direction that Halle mentioned before. So we want to look at, maybe external economies to these firms. So this is very much inspired by this paper by Alan Young in 1928, where he takes on Adam Smith and he says, well, it's not only that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, but it's also that the extent of the market is affected by the division of labor. And what he has in mind is what he calls the economies of roundabout production, which in modern lingo is network economies. Okay? So other network economies. So one thing that we can do is the following. So consider a plant J that is in industry omega. Okay? I've already shown you that the input mix of plant J is to some extent idiosyncratic. So not all the plants in industry omega are using the same mix of intermediate inputs. Okay? So here I'm using I'm showing kind of the industries that are upstream from that particular plant J. Okay? And these guys, they're also going to sell to other industries that are downstream. Okay, so I'm plotting them on the top left, and here I exclude the industry omega of plant J. Okay, so now we look at what happens if there's a negative demand shock in these industries. So a drop in the tariff on the outputs. Okay, so that's going to lead to these guys scaling down and reducing their demand for intermediate inputs from the upstream industries, and it's going to lead to a scaling down of the upstream industries as well. So maybe on the extensive margin, maybe on the intensive margin. Okay, here I'm showing extensive margin. The number of producers is going to drop. Okay, so that's what you would have in a standard neoclassical economy with constant returns. And now the interesting thing, kind of from our perspective, is what is happening to the sales of the plant J. So are these demand charts just propagating upstream, or is there also some propagation downstream? Okay, and that's exactly what we find. So here we regress the sales of the plant J on a measure of the number of producers in the upstream industries in the state where the plant J is located in. And in the OLS, you find the positive coefficient, okay, whatever that means. And in columns 4 to 6, we instrument the number of producers by, the demand shock in the other downstream industries of these upstream industries. Okay? So the first stage is effectively just a demand shock propagating upstream and leading to exit. Okay? And then as there is exit, these positive coefficients tell us that the plant J is also going to shrink. Okay, so the number of producers in the upstream industries go down, and sales of the plant J also go down. Okay? So in that sense, there is some upstream downstream propagation across industries, of the shocks across industries, and that means that there must be economies of scale somewhere. Okay, of course it could be that they're just firm level economies in the upstream industries, and because these guys are going to scale down, they're going to be producing at a higher cost, and that's why the sales of plant J are going down. That could be one explanation, or it could be network economies, that because there's exits, it's going to be harder for the industry armator to find suppliers and so on. Okay. And one thing I also want to mention is, so we still find this positive and significant coefficient if we include industry times E effects. Okay. So what that means is we're identifying these changes in the sales of plant J just from within industry variation in which intermediate inputs these plants J are using. Okay. So some of them are going to be hit maybe by this, demand shocks, others not. That's exactly the variation that we're exploiting in these regressions. Okay. And you still find this positive coefficient. Okay. So in that sense, we would take the result of that regression as telling us that there must be economies of scale somewhere. Okay. Maybe they're network economies, maybe they're firm level economies. From these results alone, we cannot tell, but it's an interesting moment that we may be using in the identification. Okay. All right. So let me give you this simple model that is kind of there to illustrate the mechanisms and show a little bit the tricks that we're using, and then you can kind of fill in the details and see how we're putting that into the full model. Okay. So consider a firm that produces a good omega. Okay. And the firm can produce this good omega in two different ways, and these two different ways are perfectly substitutable. Okay. So it could be producing the good omega from omega 1. Okay. So let's say the firm is producing shirts from cloth and from cloth only. Or alternatively, the firm could produce shirts from using two upstream inputs, omega 2 and omega 3. So let's say they would be producing shirts from yarn and from dye. And in the first production step, they're combining the yarn and dye to produce cloth. And in the second step, they're just tailoring the shirts. Okay. So perfectly substitutable across these different production functions. So if they are producing shirts from cloth, they have to find a supplier for cloth. Okay. So the firm is going to search for suppliers of cloth, and it has a particular search effort H1. Okay. So this variable search effort is something that's going to generate economies of scale. If demand is very high, you're going to search more. That's going to lead to lower cost of production. Okay. So the production function of shirts from cloth is top Douglas in labor, okay, and in the intermediate input in cloth, okay, with particular coefficients alpha L and 1 minus alpha L. So we're assuming constant returns at the level of that production function. Okay, and the firm is also having a particular heat input productivity QJ. Okay, so then the firm is searching for suppliers, and it's choosing the supplier that gives him or her the lowest effective cost of cloth. So it's taking the minimum over all the suppliers that you're getting as a result of the search process in the price that is being offered, divided by a match-specific factor augmenting productivity draw. Okay, so that's idiosyncratic to that particular relationship, to that particular match. Okay, we're going to make functional firm assumptions that imply that the effective cost offered by each of these suppliers is coming from a type 2 extreme value distribution. Okay? And therefore, the minimum over all the suppliers that you're getting is again following a type 2 extreme value distribution, where the scale parameter is affected positively by the search effort. So if you're searching more, you're going to get on average lower cost of cloth, and a moment of the cost distribution of the upstream industry. So that's effectively a moment of this distribution of prices. Okay? So if the upstream sector is very productive, is offering low prices, then this has been reflected in the effective cost of cloth. Okay, and there's a particular shape parameter zeta. So that was shirts from cloth. Now shirts from yarn, you have to find suppliers for yarn and for dye, so for the two inputs, okay, that are very upstream inputs. So again, you have search effort H2 and H3. And the production function is now the nested top Douglas. It's the top Douglas from the first step, from the tailoring. Okay, and now you're also performing the first step, producing the cloth from yarn and from dye, which again we assume has a top Douglas production function in labor, in yarn, and in dye. Okay, and these are the coefficients alpha, and we again assume that the alpha sum up to 1. Okay, there's also a particular task-specific productivity draw, which we call PJ. Okay. And we made again the same functional form assumptions that imply that the effective cost of yarn and of dye are independent viable distributions with kind of the same structure for the scale parameter and with the same shape parameter. And now we kind of have this problem, which is that, you know, the Cobb-Douglas aggregate of two independent viable draws is not viable. But it turns out that if you choose the distribution of this task-specific productivity draw BJ in the right way, so namely with this particular characteristic function, then the overall aggregate again will follow a viable distribution with a scale parameter that is kind of the Cobb-Douglas aggregate of these original scale parameters from the two independent viables. Okay, so this is kind of a technical trait that we're using. We kind of reverse engineering this distribution for the BJs to make the overall bundle again have a viable distribution. Okay, and what this says is that it's very nice to compare the effective cost of buying cloth from the market, so this viable draw here, okay, with the effective cost of performing it yourself, so buying the yarn and the dye, and again you get an independent viable draw. And now comparing these two is very easy and follows the standard extreme value math. Okay, so that's kind of this trick that we're using. Okay, so going back in time, all these firms are born with productivity, heat neutral productivity QJ, and they're making the search effort choice based only on that. Okay, so what's the return from searching? The return from searching is you get lower costs and you get higher profits. So we're assuming that firms are making profits from sales to households. So they're facing isoelastic demand from the households, and they are not making any profits if they're selling to firms further downstream. So they're pricing their marginal cost there. Okay, and the firms are also assumed to face isoelastic search costs. So when they're making the search problem, they're maximizing the expected revenue from the sales to the households, okay, which depend on what they're endowed with, the heat neutral productivity and their search effort choice. Okay? Net of the search costs, okay, and that's, we're assuming it's just isoelastic. Okay? So here in the next step, we're plugging in the isoelastic demand from the household side. Okay, and now with these, you know, functional forms for the conditional expectation of the cost of production from before with the viable, you know, we are plugging in this expression from the functional form assumption from before. Okay, and this is an expression that's interesting. Okay, so here you can see, so this is the benefit from searching, this is the cost of searching, and here you can see that kind of there is an asymmetry in the returns to searching for the input one for cloth vis-a-vis the two upstream inputs, so yarn and dye. Okay, so the exponent of H1 here is 1. Okay, whereas the sum of the exponents of H2 and H3 is alpha 2 plus alpha 3, which is strictly less than 1, because remember, in this production function for producing cloth, there's also labor in there. Okay, and the 3 alphas sum up to 1. Okay, so the alpha 2 plus alpha 3 must be strictly less than 1. Okay, so what that means is that the returns to searching are more concave for the inputs that are further upstream, for yarn and for dye. Okay, so that effectively implies that there's a non-homogeneity. So if the firm is getting a higher Q draw, okay, it's going to search more for all the inputs because the returns for searching are higher for all the inputs. Okay, but it's going to disproportionately increase the search effort for the downstream inputs for cloth more than for yarn and for dye. Okay, because whenever, you know, if you search more for cloth, you're going to get cheaper cloth. That's great. If you search more for yarn and for dye, you're going to get effectively also a lower cost of producing cloth, but disproportionately less because you still have to pay the worker to, you know, to produce the cloth from yarn and from dye. And the cost of that worker does not go down. Okay, so that's effectively causing this non-homogeneity here. Okay, so that's how we think about this size span relationship. Firms are born with ex-ante heterogeneous queues, okay, within an industry. The guys that are born with a high Q, they're going to search more. They're going to search more for all the inputs, but disproportionately more for the inputs to the further downstream. Okay, and therefore, on average, they're more likely to end up using the input that is further downstream. So in this case, cloth. Okay, and end up looking more vertically specialized. Okay, So this structure of non-homogeneity is coming from the fact that, you know, in each production step you have one input, at least one input that you cannot invest in to reduce the cost of that. Okay, plus an assumption about elasticities of substitution, namely that there is a stronger elasticity of substitution across the different production functions, okay, across the different modes of specialization, than within a particular production function, within a particular stage production function. So here we're assuming perfect substitutability across the two degrees of specialization, and we assume Cobb-Douglas within each production step. So that's effectively satisfying this you know, condition on these parameters. Okay.
Johannes, does it also have implicit, if you go to the previous page, that the BJ is not necessarily equal to the QJ? Because if it were, if you're more productive and you're also just proportionately more productive to produce the upstream goods, then
so that's important. So well, so we're making an assumption that the B is independent from the Q. So we're not baking in anything about, you know, different, you know, productivities at different stages.
You're going to be good at making the other. A perfect correlation. Okay, got it.
So this is kind of not coming from this thing here. If you have a particular correlation, then yeah. So if you assume that the good guys according to high Q, you know, also have, you know, differential cost of doing something yourself, then in some ways you're, you know, almost mechanically getting such a result. But that's not what we're doing here. Yeah. All right. Okay. So in that sense, I only have a couple of minutes left. So let me kind of show you how we are putting this into a full model. In the full model, we're using the same kind of structure. We're having a large number of industries omega. You should think of these, you know, as corresponding to these 5-digit goods from before. Each of these guys is going to sell both to final households facing isoelastic demand for its particular variety, and also to firms that are further downstream. And we again assume that they're making profits from sales to the households, but not when they sell to firms further downstream. Okay. Entry is elastic to some extent, so higher expected profits are going to lead to a higher number of firms in the industry. Okay, but with a particular elasticity, so there's not perfectly free entry and there's not completely inelastic entry, but we're somewhere in between. Okay, and then the production functions of all these firms, or kind of the set of production functions that they can choose from, is effectively given by what we call a production tree. Okay. So the output is fixed, that's the omega that you produce, but then there can be any number of layers, so vertically related production steps, and in each step there can be, you know, each of these steps can be using an arbitrary number of intermediate inputs, okay? So the way we're making that tractable is the same tricks as before, right? So you have a Cobb-Douglas production function for each of those steps. You're getting a viable cost draw for the intermediate inputs in each of those steps. They're independent. If you make the right assumption about the task-specific productivity distribution, you can map that into a viable again, and you know, comparing the viable for making yourself versus buying from the market is kind of the simple thing. So the shape parameter is always assumed to be the same, okay? And the fact that it's survivable and it's independent is preserved by this assumption about the task-specific productivity draw. Okay, so the firm is facing this make or buy decision for each of those, you know, steps, the production modules, if you want. And it's the same structure as before, where I showed you just, you know, with two layers and with two intermediate inputs on the upstream one, but you know, can be any number of them. Okay. The timing is again the same as before. So we are thinking that firms are born with ex ante heterogeneous productivity. They're making a search effort choice based on that. So more productive firms are going to search more. They're going to get a larger set of supplier draws. They're going to get lower cost on average. But these search efforts will be tilted towards the more downstream inputs for the firms that are born with a higher ex ante productivity. Okay, so same stuff as before. We can be a little bit more flexible as to what affects the number of draws that you're getting. So we're assuming that, of course, if you search more, if you have a higher search effort, you're going to get more draws. But in principle, this could also be affected by, for example, the number of potential suppliers in an upstream industry. So then, that's how we would be thinking about network economies. So remember, entry is elastic. Entry is being affected by demand conditions. So maybe there are more firms entering, and maybe that means that for a given search effort, you're gonna get more draws and therefore lower costs. Okay, so that's how we would be thinking about that. Okay, but how exactly that function M of J looks like is something that you have to parameterize, and that will be governing the strength of these network economies. Okay, so firms are minimizing the ex post cost, which is the same thing as maximizing profit. So they're making these organizational choices to do that. Okay, so these functional form assumptions from before, they always imply that the conditional cost distributions are following the Weibull with this particular shape parameter, and you can get this nice recursive structure of the scale parameters of these Weibulls, and that depends exactly on the scale parameters in these upstream nodes and so on. So you get this kind of recursive structure. We're assuming that this tree is finite, and then you can kind of solve this problem recursively starting from the very upstream nodes. Okay? So wrapping up, this is effectively the point where we are right now. So one thing that we could be talking about is differentiated versus standardized inputs. Maybe there's a different degree of heterogeneity for different types of goods, and maybe search is important for some, and therefore scale economies are present for some inputs, but not for others. Okay? We could have firms making profits also when they're selling further downstream. So maybe this is something that might be quantitatively relevant. But ultimately, what we want to do is, and where we want to go is, we want to identify scale economies. So scale economies here are coming from two sources. One is this search mechanism, right? You're facing higher demand, you're going to invest more into searching, therefore you're going to get lower cost of production. That's at the firm level. And then at the network or industry level, there could be these economies from entry, and entry implies that for given search effort of the downstream firms are getting more draws, okay, and therefore lower cost. Okay? So in that sense, that might also be relevant. The way how we are thinking of identifying these two things, so two parameters, at least two parameters, if you parameterize this M of J function using one parameter, so that J to the M if you want, okay? Then this would be one parameter. So one parameter for firm level economies, one parameter for network economies. And we're thinking of identifying this using two different moments. One moment is the within industry relationship between size and span. Okay, that's being affected by the H, by this by this mechanism whereby firms with a higher productivity are going to search more, or maybe from these demand shock regressions. So the extent of division of labor being affected by the extent of the market kind of regressions. That's one moment. The second moment is this upstream downstream propagation of shocks. That's going to be affected both by the firm level economies and by network economies, but conditional on having identified the H from the within industry relationships. Okay, the second moment would be identifying the presence of these network economies. Okay? So that's kind of where we want to go. And once we have identified these scale economies, we can perform counterfactuals and say something about how important these margins are for productivity of firms, adequate productivity, and so on. Okay. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Johannes. So now we'll just open up the floor for questions, comments. Just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in.
Hi, this is Kim Ye. I enjoyed it a lot. I have several comments. I'll make one or two now and then wait and then make a couple later. So one is just a reference. There's this paper by Nuno Limao and Yang Zhu that is trying to, I think, get at similar issues. The Alan Young thing and Adam Smith, division of labor is limited by the extent of the market.
Yeah.
The second is just on the main stylized fact that higher size is associated with more increased vertical specialization. And this just reflects my own ignorance, but I thought that bigger firms, were more vertically integrated and, they did more steps of the vertical chain. And so I guess that fact is wrong, or is the fact wrong for the Indian firms, or,
So maybe, so I mean, there are a bunch of things that should be affecting this. So I mean, here I should say we're really conditioning on plants. Okay, we're looking at plant size. There's maybe this multi-plant dimension. There's maybe also the dimension about the output choice, right? Here we are kind of comparing firms that produce a particular output, and you could imagine that just like the firms are facing the, this decision about which steps, how far up do you go in the value chain, and what you do yourself is kind of, you could say, how far down do you go in the value chain. So in that sense, I mean, maybe there's also this, that maybe the multi-product margin is also relevant when you're doing this comparison. So all these things we've switched off, and our fact, I would say, is conditional on looking at that margin. But I have
my experience
I was also surprised when I saw this.
My experience in manufacturing in China would support what you just said. And in the boardrooms, when your senior managers are all sitting together in a weekly meeting, deciding whether to vertically integrate or what to do, in general, I'm generalizing here, the basic way that's formulated is, let's stick to our core interests, our core competencies, and let's go along that path.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I think there's one paper in China, Kalina, Manover, and co-authors, which are going a little bit at that direction. But again, the data means that they're kind of looking at different margins. They're looking at which goods the firms are importing and so on. So there are a couple of differences. But yeah, that's great.
So the one aspect of it that you didn't talk about, but it's intrinsic in the literature, it's all over the literature in vertical integration, is contractual frictions, right? And since you're looking at, I guess by intuition is that Kim Lee-Yi's pattern might hold for very technologically advanced firms whose inputs, there may be some patent issues that they don't want to outsource, or this specific knowledge that they don't want to outsource, or they can't because it's very new. So in that upper tail, things may not hold, but they wouldn't be in your Indian data set.
Yeah. I mean, so at least so we have some very large firms, and we also have some very large plants. In the data, it doesn't seem that kind of on the right. Well, okay, so maybe I should go back to this. So you may have seen kind of this slight non-monotonicity in this fact here on the left tail. So these are kind of the large firms that have, relatively large firms that are relatively specialized. So this non-monotonicity is not coming from these mechanisms that you're mentioning, but this is just coming from the fact that there are a couple of plants that report the same intermediate inputs as what they're reporting as an output. And for those guys, we've assigned a distance of 0 to each of those inputs. Now, if you take out these guys, you see a nice monotonous relationship. Yeah? So in that sense, I mean, of course, you may very well be right about the firm level and so on, but at least at the plant level, we're not seeing kind of that there's a different relationship for the very large guys. If you take out, this fact that there are a couple of firms that report the same input as output.
Yeah, so Kim, let me just, if I don't mind jumping in. I think we were pretty surprised by the result that the big firms seem like they're more specialized. Like in most other dimensions that you look at the data, you do find that bigger firms just do more stuff. And it was kind of, from that perspective, it's kind of interesting that this is at least one dimension where it doesn't seem to be that way. And again, this is conditioning on plants who are doing exactly the same thing. Relatedly, and maybe related to Nuno Lamau and Yang Zhu's paper and other papers that have thought about Smithian growth, I think what we're the kind of mechanism that we have isn't really the classic Smithian mechanism that's built into these other papers. So the classic Smithian mechanism is about there's some fixed transaction costs or something like that, and the bigger scale allows you to grow, and the transaction cost is not so important, and whatnot. That leads you to do more transactions. That's not what the kind of prediction you would get out of that model is exactly the opposite of this within industry relationship. That if transaction costs were the thing that were driving things, then you would expect that the big firms to again do more in-house, and that's not what we're finding. So the mechanism we have is not the classic Smithian mechanism, and so I think that's something that we're doing our best to try to look at the data, figure out what the mechanism is, but we think that the one we're describing, I think, is better supported by the data than the classic Smithian one.
So can I just jump in with maybe like two somewhat unrelated points? The first is, when we're thinking about scale economies of the firm, one sort of natural scale economy is just kind of ordering frictions. As you get bigger, kind of like the fixed order costs go down. So two of my students, Armin Ketelari and Shafat Khan, look precisely at this in the Indian data. And you definitely see that as firms get bigger, their inventories are kind of managed much more efficiently. I think that's more evidence for maybe it's kind of what you talked about, the Smithian fixed cost story, but that makes it hard sometimes to measure productivity at the firm, and that's kind of the point of their paper. So I think it'd be interesting to sort of see if they also look at like this Indian trade liberalization. They see like a big change in like the management of inventories on inputs. So that might be something that you guys want to look at a little bit. The other thing I was kind of struggling with was kind of thinking about what you're talking about in a dynamic framework, right? So in some sense, there's the search, every period I'm not going to search for a new set of suppliers. And so in some sense, there's going to be some kind of lock into like a production process related to who my suppliers were yesterday. But likewise, there could be some lock in just because of the capital that I have in my plant. So I don't know if is there any way in your empirical work to sort of look for those kinds of stories that again, these are slightly unrelated to like the vertical specialization, but they do speak to like the way you might want to think about looking at the data.
Yeah, so in the Indian data, it's very hard to say something about suppliers because you don't really see the suppliers directly, so you don't know whether there are changes in that. You just see whether there's a change in the intermediate input that you're using. Right. So it's kind of hard to talk about that, but at the same time, I mean, kind of what's relevant from our perspective is that there is some margin where you invest in the effective cost of a particular input. So that doesn't necessarily need to be the search for suppliers, right? It could also be you're training the workforce to work with inputs, a particular input, and so in that sense, the way at least I would see these things is not necessarily related to the relationship with the suppliers, even though that's of course one natural thing to look at, which unfortunately in this data is very hard to do. But yeah, I mean, I think these are super interesting questions, and maybe we can go in that direction.
Yeah, there's an interesting life cycle pattern as well about specialization, which is it seems like the young firms are less specialized than older ones. So like over the life cycle, you sort of become more specialized. Like the image is like when you're first doing a project, you do everything yourself, and eventually you start outsourcing more stuff. That seems like it's consistent with what the patterns that we saw.
We have a question on the model. So it looks like one of the results is that you have this endogenous non-homotheticity, and if that interpretation is correct, then I think that's a very nice result. And then you probably know there have been some recent papers that have extended these forms of non-homotheticity to the supply side, to the production function side. Like there was this recent Princeton graduate, Fabian Trotner, who did that in this paper, and I guess I think it would be interesting to know, like, I mean, just to compare this kind of endogenous non-homotheticity against exogenous, assumed non-homotheticity, and just, what are the differences?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, here the non-homotheticity is coming partly from the elasticity. So the elasticities matter for that. So the elasticity of substitution within and across production functions, and of course the alpha, so kind of the input output, the technical coefficients, if you want. I don't know Trotner's paper as well. Maybe Ezra, I'm sure you will know it better.
Yeah, I mean, so in some sense, it's if you have an exogenous framework that has the same reduced form as the endogenous framework, you're not going to find many differences. I mean, I think that the place you can look for differences, you got to figure out what margins will affect things. So perhaps one way to think about it is, suppose you take the search micro foundation of where the effort is going seriously. Perhaps you can have some variation in the environment, in the search environment, that would affect how strong the non-homotheticity is. So, for example, suppose that the gains from search are stronger for some goods than for other ones, right? So suppose that's a just fact. So, like perhaps for more differentiated inputs, it's more there are more gains from search than for standardized ones. Then one prediction of this type of model where it's endogenous is that the non-homothetic features will be stronger where the gains from search are stronger. So that's one reason why you might see the non-homothetic follow a certain pattern. So you can look for things like that sort of rationalize why the non-homotheticity looks a certain kind of way that will be encouraging for the particular micro foundation of the non-homotheticity.
I mean, our non-homotheticity is also one that is particularly speaking to the degree of distance, if you want, of the inputs from the outputs, and to this particular structure about which inputs are being used less and which inputs are being used more. And that's kind of emerging from this framework, which, if you just wrote it down in a very simple way without that structure, then there would be lots of degrees of freedom about which inputs would go down, which go up and down and so on. Yeah.
I thought the way that you modeled it was very cool. The only question I have is whether it generates mechanically some pattern in the input share of the firm relative to labor. In some of the data sets that I've looked at, there's really no relationship between firm size and that variable. I mean, larger firms are more capital intensive, but if you look at just material goods and labor, there doesn't seem to be much of a systematic pattern except for the very top. So have you looked at that variable, and does the model predict anything systematic about it?
So the model would predict the labor and material share varying across the different chosen organizations of the firm. So that's at least how we would be thinking about this coefficient or that coefficient, about kind of the span and the material share versus the primary inputs. Conditional on a particular organization, we would because of the Cobb-Douglas assumption, we would not see any variations in the shares. I think these can be fixed with tricks from Ezra's previous paper, but at least we think it's not absolutely crucial here.
Yeah, I have to go too. It's very nice.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Johannes, maybe I missed this, but one of the returns to search is more valuable when the prices are more dispersed, right? And you have price data. Did you leverage the price data in any way to sort of look at industries where there's more price dispersion? You see, more vertical, changes in vertical specialization in the way that your model predicts.
I mean, so that's the only thing what we did. We were looking at the unit costs and how they move with the tariff liberalization. That's kind of trying to go to the economies of scale relatively directly. Of course, you know, the big issue is that, so first of all, you have to do this comparison from
These are
before
production.
1990.
Sorry, these are the production unit costs, or these are the input unit costs?
These are the production unit costs.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is not, sorry, this is not going what like at the direction that you wanted with looking at the unit cost of the input. So that we haven't done. The only thing that we did with the unit costs was to trying to get at the economies of scale like more directly. But you know, you're losing a lot of observations. To be honest, I mean, working with the unit values, it's very, very hard. So that's, you know,
It always is. Yeah.
So we didn't do much there.
Yeah, so that, you know, goes back to the paper I was mentioning to my students, where, you know, they're going to attribute some of those unit cost findings that you have to changes in inventory management processes. So if you kind of go directly to something with like, you actually see that these guys are acquiring the inputs cheaper in these industries where, you know, there's a bigger return to search, that'd be kind of nice, because you have some guys who are just, you know, doing one search, and some guys are doing, you know, more search because they're at a different stage, but they're all buying the same inputs. And your theory is going to say those guys on average should have lower acquisition prices. So
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, like in the model, the way the returns to searching are in there is from the zeta parameter. So that's telling you something about the dispersion of costs in the upstream industries, and so here this is affecting kind of the zeta is here in the exponent, so that's kind of affecting the searches. So here we kind of assumed implicitly that the zeta is the same for the different industries, but yeah. We haven't really looked at inventories. I mean, all the data, whenever I say intermediate inputs here, so this is the intermediate inputs that are being consumed in the production process in that particular year. So it's not necessarily purchases.
okay.
But yeah.
Yeah, you see like, you know, if you're only buying stuff domestically, you have different inventories than if you buy stuff imported or you export. And those things change a lot because where guys are buying stuff changes a lot in this period. And so that becomes like a real issue, especially during the transition period where these guys are kind of changing their sourcing. So
yeah, that makes sense. No, I look forward to reading that paper.
yeah, definitely. Cool.
I mean, if there's time, I wanted to delve into this technical trick that you did. Maybe you can give a 1 or 2 minute summary on, in terms of combining all those Weibull distributions with the two production methods. And the metaphor I have is like this Antras and de Gortari paper where, you know, you have these Eaton-Cordon settings and you have this multi-stage production, and you know, kind of until their paper came along, you know, there was this technical issue like Frichet distributions can't really be multiplied together. And then they found a way to get around that. And kind of the way I think about it in a very simplistic way is they just had each production chain have its own Frichet distribution, and they didn't worry about the productivities of each stage of the production chain. So, but it looks like you're somehow able to maintain different productivity, you know, combine in some multiplicative way all these Weibulls. And so is it that the Weibulls are just different from Frichets, or is there something special about that BJ thing that you have?
So there's nothing different about the Weibulls. The Weibulls are just one over the Frichet. So in that sense, that's not the trick. The trick is really in choosing the distribution of the B draw in exactly the right way. So here, this is the simple case where we have two inputs, but that distribution of the B, the characteristic function, will always take that particular form, but the number, so effectively you would have one of those gamma function terms in the denominator for each of the input, and you always have kind of the alpha coefficient associated with each of these inputs. So I mean, it works out, and and indeed it allows you to have something that is specific to a particular stage and not the whole, or like a particular set of tasks that you're doing. Yeah, so in that sense, I mean, it's reverse engineered. It's fairly easy to show that it works out with this distribution, because like the product of these, you're always using the convolution. So it's kind of easy to show that it does preserve the Weibull distribution form. The hard thing is to show that this stuff is actually a characteristic function of a distribution. That takes a couple of pages, but yeah, it's a mathematical trick.